Hello, friends. Welcome to the breakout on navigating cultural differences. My name is Kristen. I'll be your host for today. And so we're going to get started in just a second. But before we do, I just want to remind you guys you're already using the chat, which is great. Feel free to include encouraging testimonies or comments there. If you have questions at any point during Jada's talk, you can use the Ask a Question feature down at the bottom of your screen, and we will have time for Q&A at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jada to come up and share with us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jada Pothina, and I'm currently at the University of Texas at Austin, here working on Chi Alpha staff with my husband, Darhas, and our two daughters, Soraya and Arlen Pothina. And I'm also serving as the Chi Alpha area rep for the South Central, and had the great honor of helping with this conference. So I'm so excited to be here today. My cross-cultural journey started when I was 8 years old, and my family moved to the border of Texas to work with Central American refugees. And one of my memories is I remember taking a photo with 1 foot standing in the United States and 1 foot standing in Mexico. And in my relationships with internationals, I've had the opportunity to have that experience of having 1 foot in at least 2, sometimes more cultures at the same time. And even though I'm the same person when I'm in different cultures, I sometimes have to act differently to be seen as the same person. So I consider myself to be a polite person in American culture. I think people would say that my parents raised me well. But when I went to India for the first time with my husband Darhas for our wedding, I had to learn a lot about how to be polite in Indian culture. So really felt like I was a kid again, learning everything all over again. So I had to learn how to address people, how to show respect, how to serve guests, what to wear, how to sit, when to take my shoes off, even the polite way to eat with my right. And if you've been in India, you know it's only your right hand. So if I continued just acting the way that I did normally in my own culture, it would have been very disrespectful and rude in that culture. But fortunately, my Indian family was very gracious with me. I have a picture here of us sitting around our table at India, and they gave me lots of love, welcomed me with grace and willingness to help me learn. And on my side, I had to change some attitudes that I had, and I had to learn how to have grace with myself when I made mistakes, and to keep cultivating a desire to learn to be able to express myself well in that culture. And as you meet international students on campus, maybe you can enjoy getting to know people from different cultural backgrounds. Or maybe you have no idea how to find common ground and build a relationship with them. Or you're worried about offending someone. I hope that as we discuss culture and begin to have a framework for understanding our own culture and the cultures around us, that this will help you to be excited as we reach out to people from different cultural backgrounds and build cross-cultural friendships. And these friendships can be not only accessible, but also enriching to our lives and can help both us and our international friends to draw closer to Jesus, who's really the best friend that anyone could ever have. So let's look at what is culture. And Patty Lane, in A Beginner's Guide to Crossing Culture, defines it like this. It's a system of meanings and values that shape one's behavior. And there's different models of culture that we could look at. One model describes culture as an iceberg, where you have the very obvious things, maybe like dress or language and things that people eat and maybe dancing, the things that you can really see on the outside of the culture that make the culture beautiful. But then you have, as you do in the case of an iceberg, you have 90% of it that's underneath the surface. And those are things like beliefs and values and worldview that maybe you don't really see from the outside, or you don't see whenever you just meet someone from that culture. But it's definitely there and it's under the surface. And as you get to know more about the culture, you get to know more about what really lies below the surface of that culture. And then Paul York often gives us the example of culture being an onion, and there's different layers of an onion. And he says that every time you peel off a new layer of culture, you cry. And that's from the perspective of a missionary who is trying to get to know a culture and is just getting frustrated by just finding different layers of things that they don't know and that they're having to learn. Another example that I've heard people use is that culture is like air, that you don't even notice it's there until you are gasping because it's not there anymore, because you're in a completely different environment. So one thing you have to know about culture is that it's not homogenous. So when we talk about culture, we don't want to talk about stereotypes and assume that everybody from a particular culture is going to be the same, because that's not what it looks like. You'll notice that people within a culture will have different personalities and different priorities, and that even if they share the same values, sometimes they don't follow the values of their culture. And you also see that cultures change over time. And so even when you're looking at a snapshot of one culture, you might have one generation that follows slightly different customs from the newer generation. And so you can see change in culture over time. But why cross cultures? And if you see on the slides, this is a picture of my very first sermon that I was able to preach in Chinese when I went on a mission trip to Taiwan. I was so excited because I worked really hard to be able to try to preach in Chinese for the first time when I went on that trip. And as we cross cultures, we can grow in being Christ-like. In John 1:14, it talks about how the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So Jesus is the first one who crossed culture. He came from the culture of heaven, and he is our model. As he came from the culture of heaven and entered into our culture here in the world, he is our model for us being able to cross cultures. And as we are able to follow him in that, we grow in becoming more like him. And then seeing how other cultures reflect Christ can help us to grow also, because as we see the beauty of their lives reflecting Christ in maybe a different way than our culture reflects Christ, then it can help us grow in humility and grow in character. I know every time I'm around Indian Christians and just the value that they place on prayer and the time that they spend in prayer and fasting and just spending time with the Lord is always challenging for me, and it helps me to grow in my character and in being more like Christ. And that's going to be the same with each and every culture. Each and every culture is going to have its own ways that it reflects the image of God in a unique way. And then each culture is going to have places where it needs to be transformed by the gospel, and that we need Christ coming into our culture to be able to transform it and to make it what it needs to be. So today we're going to look at a few cultural lenses, and a cultural lens is really a set of values that a group of people from a certain culture use whenever they look at and they think about an issue. So we're going to look at several cultural lenses. And if you want to know more about cultural lenses, there's a couple of books. One is the one I've mentioned, which is The Beginner's Guide to Crossing Culture by Patty Lane, that mentions some cultural lenses. And then also Ministering Cross-Culturally by Lingenfelter and Myers is another book that mentions some of these ways that different cultures can look at the world. So one of the ways that different cultures can see is time versus event. So the question here is, when do you start an event? So you can tell that this event, although people were joking about it starting on international time, which, really is true, but we start at a certain time, right? All of us sync our clocks and we say, okay, at 11 o'clock, we're all going to be online and we're all going to do this together. So we start it based on the clock. But in many cultures, you don't really start it based on a certain clock time. You might have a general clock time, but really you start the event when everybody who's key for that event is there and ready to start. So you really base it more on the people who are there versus the exact time whenever you need to get started. So there's this story, this picture that I have up is a picture of when I was in India, and the girl behind me is my sister Rael. And we were doing wedding shopping for Darhas and my wedding there in India. And the night before, my mother-in-law had given all of us, me and my sister and Darhas and his sister, had given all of us a very stern lecture saying, all right, everyone, we have a lot of shopping to do tomorrow. So tomorrow at 9 a.m., I need all of you to be ready and dressed and ready to go, because we're going to go out and we're going to meet your uncles and we're going to go shopping. So, of course, my sister and I from American culture were like, oh, man, she is serious. We had better get ready. So, of course, by 8:50 a.m., we're dressed, we're showered, we're ready, we're sitting on the couch, we're ready to go shopping. Well, the rest of the family is just now getting up, just now drinking coffee, just now starting to call the uncles to find out what time they're going to meet. And so we learned very quickly that really like 9 a.m. is not actual starting time. That's more like relative time that we're going to start the process of starting. So, but it was an event. They were expecting it to be an event, whether or not it started at a certain time. The second type of cultural lens has to do with how much do you perceive that there is a crisis or a non-crisis. So the reason why I have these dishes in the sink is because I think it elicits certain mentality from different ones of us. So I don't know if you're like me, when you see a whole sink full of dishes, that kind of initiates like a crisis mentality, like, oh no, this is terrible. This needs to be solved right now. Or maybe we need to plan in advance, make a chart, like who's going to do these dishes so that we can solve this issue of having the dishes out of the sink and not stay there overnight, right? So for me, I see this whole sink full of dirty dishes, and it kind of has a crisis mentality to it, like, oh, this is a problem that needs to be solved right now. Now, when my husband Darhas and I got married, and maybe this is the same for some of the rest of you who are getting married, that we have a completely different mentality. Darhas looks at this sink and doesn't see any kind of crisis at all. He's like, oh, it's dishes. They'll get done at some point. We don't need to plan for them to get done. They'll just get done eventually. And if I ask him to do the dishes, he's like, all right. And then like 2 hours later, like, Darhas, have you done the dishes? Oh yeah, I'm going to do that. But it has no sense of crisis or like this has to be done right now. And you'll see that. I think a lot of times we as Americans have more of a crisis mentality where we feel like certain things have to be taken care of by a certain time or else it's going to be an issue. And then there's some cultures that it's not really a crisis until it really is a crisis. And then once there is a crisis, you can respond to it. But they don't see the world in that framework. The other type of cultural lens that's very common around the world is a group lens versus an individual lens. So if you have a culture that's a group culture, if you look down at the bottom corner of the slide, you see exercise in China. So when I was living in China teaching English, every morning, the whole university would wake up to music on the loudspeaker. And all of the students, I didn't have to do this since I was a teacher, but all of the students would go out to the field in the middle of the university and they would all do their morning exercises together in unison with loudspeakers that were over the whole campus. Now, here at the University of Texas, where I've been working with Chi Alpha for many years, the top picture over here with the girl on the exercise machine, that's how students do their morning exercise if they choose to do it at all. It's very individual experience. You have your earphones in, you have your own screen on your own bicycle, and you're doing your exercise, and maybe other people in the room are doing completely different exercises. Some people are sleeping in. It's not considered a group experience. And if you see the picture on the left, this is our street in India. And right across the street from our house in India, there is a juice shop. And I used to want to just walk across the street to the juice shop and get a juice. And I've been in many countries by myself. I've been able to navigate the street, and it was just across the street. But they always wanted to send like cousins with me. If I wanted to go across the street to get juice, they wanted to send aunts, uncles with me. They always wanted to send someone with me. And I would get a little frustrated, like, don't you guys trust me? Don't you think I can walk across the street by myself? I've been here several times now. But for them, it was not about that. For them, they couldn't even imagine, like, why would somebody want to go get a juice by themselves? Like, that doesn't make any sense. In the group culture, it's all about the experience of being with each other. And so they wouldn't want to go do something by themselves. They couldn't even imagine that I would want to do that. And so to care for me and to honor me, they wanted to make sure that they always sent cousins and uncles and aunts and anyone who was available to go with me whenever I wanted to do something. Another type of cultural lens is a high context versus a low context. And in a high context culture, everything has a significance, especially when you're trying to honor someone or you're trying to make a big deal out of something. So let's say, for example, a birthday. So you would dress up, look really nice, versus on the right-hand side, you see an Indian birthday at a college student's apartment that's more very low context and is not formal at all. My stepmother is from Ukraine, and when she first came to the United States, she came to visit me in Austin with my dad. And it happened to be the birthday of one of my good friends. And so after we'd taken them sightseeing around Austin a little bit, I said, hey, let's go stop by my friend's apartment. She's just having a small get together with a cake for her birthday. I just want to go say hi to her for a little bit. And she'll love it if you all come too and just say hi to her. And my stepmother was shocked. She's like, no, we're wearing shorts. We're not dressed up. Like, how can we go to a birthday party? And I said, well, you know, it's a college student birthday party. I'm sure it's not going to be formal or anything. I'm sure everybody's going to be dressed just like we are. And she said, no, that's not possible. It's a birthday party. You can't go like this. And what I found out is that in Ukraine, it's very high context for a birthday party. There's a certain way you have to dress up. There's a certain invitation thing that you have to go through to do a birthday party. And so she was very shocked when we showed up for the party and she found everybody in shorts and people just popping by to say hello very informally. That was not the way that she was expecting for it to go. So when you have a high context event, there's certain rules that may not be very open. Like people may not state these rules directly, but there's certain rules about how things have to go and how you have to dress and where you have to be. In a low context, people don't care as much about that, and they're more direct about what they say. So they can just say happy birthday and give them a gift, but there's not a lot of necessarily rules behind that that you might offend someone if you don't follow them. So these are not the only cultural lenses. This is just a sample. And so what I'd like to talk about a little bit is our response to these cultural lenses, because really we have a couple of responses that we can respond with when we come into contact with a cultural lens that's different from ours. And so one response is to a response of understanding and realizing, oh, this must be a cultural difference. Let me understand what values come from your cultural lens. And what that helps us to do is not make conclusions about motives or what the person is communicating when someone values something differently and has behaviors that are different from what we would expect. And the other way to respond whenever there's a cultural difference is misattribution. And misattribution is attributing meaning or motive to behavior based on your own culture or experience, which usually works fine when you're dealing with people of your own culture. But whenever you are dealing with someone of another culture, you might interpret the meaning or motive behind the behavior as being different if you use your own cultural lens to interpret it. So for example, let's think about Chi Alpha context. You have a Chi Alpha staff, let's say that's me, who is meeting an international student for coffee. Now, I'm the Chi Alpha staff member. I show up, we said 11 o'clock. And so that's my time. I'm like, all right, 11 o'clock. I'm going to get here at 11. So I get there at 11 o'clock and I'm waiting for the student. Now, remember we talked about the time orientation versus the event orientation. So according to my time orientation, this student really should get there within 10 minutes at the latest of when we said. Otherwise, it's a little bit rude, or she should at least text me, right, and let me know that she's running late. But if I sit there for 30 minutes and I don't hear from her and I text and she doesn't respond, then I might interpret that as she doesn't value me. Like, oh, she said she was going to meet me, but then she's just blowing me off and not showing up and not communicating. So let's say she does get there around 11:30 and we have coffee for like 30 minutes, but I already booked another appointment at 12:10, which I was planning to meet her for an hour, and then I need to leave at 12 so I can walk over to my other appointment at 12:10. And so exactly at 12, I have to be done because of my time orientation, right? I'm on time, so I'm leaving at noon, and I'm going to go meet my other person at 12:10. Well, she's in the middle of sharing her heart and in the middle of conversation with me, and the conversation's not over. And so from her value system, I'm not valuing her because I'm breaking it off and leaving it in the middle of the conversation because I planned something else at a particular time. So if we're doing misattribution, then each of us would decide that we don't value each other. And we don't want to have the misattribution. We want to be understanding. And that's part of the reason to learn what the cultural lenses are and to spend some time getting to know them so that whenever you encounter it, you can think, okay, well, this might be an example of us looking at things from different cultural lenses. Now, two of the goals from Crossing Cultures in Chi Alpha, we have two goals. And Katie Rawson in Crossing Cultures with Jesus says there's two goals to Crossing Cultures. One is we must learn to enter into the world of international students. And the second is to draw people from other cultures into community with us. So if you see this photo, this is taken at UT. This is a holy festival with the students celebrating Indian culture and the Festival of Holi. At UT, there's a lot of Indian students, and they often have festivals that they enjoy on campus together. And so that's a great opportunity to enter into the world of international students on campus, to go to some of their events, to be able to see how they live and get to know them and their culture. And what that does is whenever you go to their events and you go into their world, when you go to their apartment, you get to listen and learn and observe, and you're the stranger. So you get to learn what it's like to be the stranger, which is their experience whenever they come into your world. And so when you learn how to be the stranger, then you're able to understand and communicate and help them whenever it's their turn to come into your world and be the stranger. Also, when you enter into the world of international students, you can learn to be willing to change. So you add new behaviors and you stop doing behaviors that create conflict. So when I went to India with my Indian family, I had to add new behaviors like taking off my shoes when I went into the house. I had to stop doing behaviors that created conflict, like taking off and walking across to places just by myself without talking with people, right? That independence. And so whenever you're entering into the world of another culture, it's your responsibility to change your behavior and to adjust to that culture. And then you learn to value the others. You learn them as individuals, not stereotyping or viewing them as less capable because they're not exactly like you. And then the last thing is drawing international students into community with us. And this is a recent game night with some international students that we had at our house. And part of drawing international students into community is just hospitality. So some simple things you can do, especially for Indian students, is setting up a vegetarian option, or for Muslim students, a non-pork option. Those things can communicate welcome whenever you are offering them food that they can eat and enjoy. And then contextualization of the gospel. And we're going to have a breakout about this later on this afternoon, but contextualization of the gospel is really offering the gospel in a cup that they can drink from. So Sadhu Sundar Singh in India tells a story about an Indian holy man, which is called a Brahmin, and he was on a train in India and became exhausted and dehydrated. And then one of his fellow passengers offered him some water, but he refused it. And then one of the train officials offered him water again, and he refused that too. But finally, one of the people trying to help him realized that he had his own cup that was there next to him. And so when they put water in his own cup and offered it to him, he drank it readily and he was able to be recovered. So Sadhu Sundar Singh says that this is related to sharing the gospel within India. And he said that if you offer the water of life in our own cup, we would be happier to accept it. And so as we're talking with international students, we may need to find out, like, what cup do we need to offer the gospel in? Not to change the content of it, but to offer it in a way that they can understand it and accept it. And then we disciple them to live for Christ in their own cultural context and in the cultural context that they're in, which is usually the United States, if you're here in the United States. And so part of the things that we can do is we can encourage them to read the Bible in their own language, to interact with believers from their culture, if we can find them, and just encourage them that even when they go back into their home cultural context, that they're going to be able to live out the things that they're learning about Christ. And then we empower international students to be leaders on campus and beyond. So are you presenting examples of international students in leadership to them? And are you creating opportunities for them to be invited to leadership in a way that they feel they can do it and that it encourages them to participate? So crossing cultures is often challenging as we encounter different layers of values and as we struggle to understand international students and communicate Christ. But if we keep practicing humility and keep practicing a willingness to learn from people who are different from us, we'll begin to experience the rewards of crossing cultures and not only the frustrations. We'll see a difference in our own character and the ability that we have to reflect Christ. And we pray that eventually we'll have the great joy of welcoming friends from around the world who otherwise might not have been welcomed, both as brothers and sisters in Christ's family and also co-laborers in the kingdom of God. So thank you. I hope you have questions about crossing cultures and about the things that we talked about today. So I'm going to invite Kristen back up, and she's going to help us with some of the questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jada. If you haven't taken the time to write your question in the ask a question tool down at the bottom, go ahead and do that. At this point, looks like we've already got a couple. So Jada, our first question is, what are some ways to ask critical or big questions without being accidentally disrespectful or sound lecturing when talking to people from other nations?
So I think international students are pretty good at telling the motive behind your question. So let's say, for example, a big question is who do they believe God is, for example. So is your motive to lecture them, or is your motive to really learn from them and learn who they really think God is? And I think as you ask questions, if your motive is to learn and to find out more about them and their culture so that you can really get to know them and build a relationship with them, I don't think that you're going to be offensive. And when you cross cultures, at some point you are going to make a mistake and you are going to be offensive just because you're navigating different cultures. And you just have to realize that. And when you do realize it, be the first to apologize and say, hey, I think that crossed the line. That looks like you weren't comfortable answering that in your culture, and I'm really sorry. But I don't think you should assume that at the beginning. Don't assume you're going to be offensive. I think you just come with the attitude of wanting to learn, wanting to get to know the student, and I think you're going to be able to have some great conversations.
Awesome. Okay, so our next question, Jada, is, so are introverts and extroverts part of the Western ideology of individualism? Are there introverts in group cultures?
Haha, that is a great question because I don't know how many Indian cousins. I have lost count. And there are definitely introverts and extroverts in Indian culture. And what's very interesting is that whereas an introvert in American culture might go elsewhere apart from the group, the introvert in an Indian culture sits there in the middle of the group and is very quiet. And everyone else is talking around them and they're still in the middle of the group. And we have one cousin in particular that I'm thinking of. Whenever I went to Darhas's family in India, he was always there in the middle of the group of cousins. I would say 95% of Darhas's family is extroverts. They're loud and just, especially when they're mainly around each other, not around outsiders. They're just very loud and talking all the time and talking over each other. But there's one cousin that just sits there quietly and he doesn't talk unless you talk to him individually and motivate him with questions. So yes, you'll get them.
So what are some ways to cross cultural boundaries in a small group setting?
Okay, that's a good question. In a small group setting. So in a small group setting, I think you actually have an advantage because it's small. So you can get to know everybody pretty well in your group and you can ask them about what their culture is and what are some things that they're comfortable with. So I think crossing cultural boundaries, let's say you have an international student who visits your small group. One thing that you just need to be aware of if they're from a completely unchurched background is just knowing that you're going to need to introduce things a little bit to them as you go. And so we've had some students visit church with us, for example, that were from a completely Hindu background, never been in a church before, or Muslim background, never been in a church before. So usually if it's possible to talk with that student before the small group and just kind of go through like, hey, this is what we do when we're in a small group. We'll probably chat for a while. We're probably going to pray and talk with God together. You might see some people close their eyes whenever they do that, and that's just so they can focus on God. We're going to read the Bible. Do you have a Bible? Can I show you a little bit about how the Bible is organized? We have the Old Testament, we have the New Testament. So just realize that depending on what their background is and what cultural background, some of the things that you take for granted with other members of your small group, you may have to just go through and explain a little bit more. But that doesn't mean that they can't grasp it, or like as soon as you introduce it, they're going to understand it. It'll take, depending on their background. Now, you could get an international student from India or Nigeria that's been a Christian for a long time and is very strong in their faith and knows the Bible, has read it like 10 times and prays for 2 hours every day. Like, we have those kind of international students too, and they're awesome. And so I guess just getting to know the student and their cultural background. Now, those kind of students, usually you have to cross cultures and explain, help them to understand American Christianity and the value that we have for reaching out to others and discipling others. Like those kind of students, like that's where Darhas was whenever he came here. He had a great relationship with the Lord, but he didn't understand the value of discipling and reaching out to others. So in a small group setting, it's just so important with anyone, even if they're not international students, but definitely if they are international students, finding out their church background, finding out what their cultural background is, maybe even have some discussions about that in a small group and get to know where people are.
Okay, so it looks like our next question is, if students have rejected religion in the past because of hurt in their cultural context, what are some ways to encourage them to learn about Jesus?
Yeah, we've had some Korean students specifically in that situation before, where they were rejecting Christianity because of bad experiences in their cultural context. And I think that it's maybe even similar to an American student who's had a bad church background experience and is a little bit shy of attending religious things. You really have to start with the relationship, and that may or may not be able to be within a religious setting. So a student like that may not be willing to come to small group or to like a large group gathering. It may need to start with coffee and building trust. Usually you'll have to rebuild trust because trust has been broken in some way. And so to rebuild that trust, you may need to spend time with that student. And then if it's at all possible to make that relationship go beyond just you, because you're going to build trust with that student as an individual. But if you can build that trust not only between you and the student, but between your spiritual community and the student. So if there are ways that your small group together can spend time with that student and build trust as a community with that student in a way that would make them see who Jesus is and how much Jesus loves them without the pressure of committing to go to a Bible study or a place where they may not feel safe, then I think that's the best opportunity if you're able to. Because otherwise they'll say, oh, well, you're trustworthy, but I still don't trust the Chi Alpha or the church group or whatever. And so if it's possible to build trust even beyond yourself with people from your community, then I think that can start healing that and helping them to see that this is how we are representing Jesus together.
Okay, so our next one is, how do you navigate language barriers effectively?
Well, there's always Google Translate. I have resorted to that a couple of times in desperate situations. Like type and then show it to them and you hope it's translating it correctly. Yeah, I think you end up getting creative. I remember my very first crossing cultures experience was when I was 9 years old. We moved down to the valley, and that was when I had the 1 foot in Mexico, 1 foot in the U.S. experience. But there was a little Nicaraguan girl named Fanny, that I was making friends with. And I knew like 3 words of Spanish and she knew like 3 words of English. And between the two of us, I would say, jugar, and she would say, yes. And anyway, we would end up playing together. Of course, as adults, it's a little harder. But depending on the level, you have different tools that can help you. One is if you can get another person from their culture to help you translate, that's probably better than Google Translate. But if you don't have that, then download app on your phone and have them download an app on their phone, and you can still make it work to try to communicate together. Now, hopefully, if they're here in the United States, they're interested in learning English. And so most of the time that's the case. And so they will be very happy to practice English with you. And hopefully you can also refer them to different, maybe if there's church programs around your area that offer English classes, that may be a really good way to get them started and get them interested in learning more about the gospel. But even if that's not the case, let's say they're a spouse of a student and so their English level is really low because they're not really involved in a lot of social things in English, there's still ways to be able to get around that.
Cool. So it looks like we've got time for just a few more. So Jada, how have you found students, or how open have you found students to be to prayer? And how should you respond if students of other religions want to pray to other gods with you?
That's interesting. I have found international students to be very open to prayer in most cases. Even Muslim students and people from other religions, I have had them be very open to me praying for them in the name of Jesus. I would say it's usually atheistic students, maybe even from either Chinese or European backgrounds, maybe a little more closed to it if they are not believing in God at all. But students who want to pray to other gods with me, so I guess there's a couple of things that I've done. One is I have just said, especially in a small group context, we've said something like, this is a time for us to pray to Jesus. And this is what, just being very specific about what we're doing. And we are open about, like, we don't pray to other gods, that we are only able to pray to one God. That's part of the commitment that we make whenever we become a Christian and we pledge to follow Christ, is that we only follow one God. And that's important to make a distinction, I think, with Indian students in particular who can accept infinite number of gods. It's important to say, that part of Christianity is belief in one God and that we only pray to them. And however, I don't think there's any necessarily a bad thing of understanding that they also pray and that they also may pray to a different God. I just think that in making it in a small group context, this is not a context for praying. This is a context for praying to Jesus.
Okay. So I think we have time probably for one more. So Jada looks like the one that has the most upvotes right now. Is what are some ways to offer someone Christian context in their own cups, like what you were talking about?
So let me think of India, because that's what I interact with the most with our huge family in India, because usually the cup is going to have to be cultural specific. But even, okay, if you take the culture of college students, right? It's kind of what we're doing in Chi Alpha. We're offering the gospel in a cup that college students can drink, which is heavily relational. It's heavily focused on felt needs of students. It's focused on helping to communicate to them in a way that they can understand. And so when you're talking about, I really encourage you to go to the session, the 3D Gospel, if you're interested in that topic this afternoon, because they're going to talk about it more. But really, different cultures have a different idea of what the good news is and what the bad news is related to the gospel. And so whenever you're talking about honor and shame cultures, there's actually a really good app called Honor Restored that shares the gospel from an honor and shame cultural perspective, that you can download. It's part of a God Tools app on your phone that you can use, and you can look at it, and it shares the gospel from that perspective. There's also a fear power perspective, where the bad news is that there's a lot of spiritual forces out there that are negative and that are bad and that are dangerous. And so the good news is, like, we had an African student who basically told us he became a Christian because he wanted to be safe. He believed that Jesus could protect him, and he believed that other relatives of his had been killed by voodoo, and that he wanted to be safe, and he knew that the church was a place of safety. I actually had a student in Taiwan tell me that too, that she ended up becoming a Christian because she felt at peace and she knew that she was safe, whereas at her home she felt that there were spirits that were not helping and that were being dangerous, but that when she called on Jesus, that he protected her from those. And so whenever you're talking about those different kinds of cultural contexts, I think learning how to share the gospel in a way where they understand what the good news is and how they can fit that into their perspective is one way to do the different cups. Another way is just not being offensive. Like when I'm in India, I wear Indian clothes. I try to follow the rules of the culture. I take off my shoes when I need to take off my shoes. And that just eliminates distractions and helps them to be able to see what I'm telling them and how I'm sharing with them, and not them saying, "Oh, you're being disrespectful and you're doing something that's completely outside our cultural box that's distracting them from the gospel."
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jada. It looks like we don't have time to answer any more questions, but we do have some other great questions in the chat here. So how can they get those questions answered?
I think there will be saved on this, so I can try to answer those questions by email later, maybe.
Okay.
And if are we able to know who asked those questions in the chat?
Yes.
Okay, then I can try to get those answer those questions by email.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. If you would, at this point, go up to the schedule tab at the very top of your screen and select the next breakout that you're going to go to. Next up, we've got the This Is My Story breakouts, and those are really, really cool, so you won't want to miss those. So thank you guys so much.